Someone once said the loudest stories begin in quiet rooms. Buffy knew that room well. A dim corner, a single chair, and a breath that carried the weight of a whole generation. There was a time when his voice made crowds erupt, when his beatbox shook the floors of small clubs and big arenas. But the last years were different. The echo that once lifted him now pressed against his chest, like a memory too heavy to hold. Hip-hop had exploded into a global force. Billboards, record deals, new stars everywhere. And in that rush, the door slowly closed on the very man who helped build the foundation. It is a painful truth. The industry learned to shine brighter, but its light did not reach back for the ones who lit the first spark. And Buffy, a pioneer in every sense, found himself watching a world he helped create grow without him. So we begin with a question that sits heavy in the heart. How does a culture move forward while leaving its own architect in the shadows? And what does it mean when a legend fades, not because he failed, but because no one looked back? This is the story of that silence. And of the man the industry should never have forgotten. Before the world forgot his name, Buffy lived with a kind of strength that did not need applause. He grew up in a time when music was not a path to fame, but a way to breathe. In the neighborhood where he learned to hold rhythm in his hands, hip-hop was not yet an industry. It was a refuge, a pulse that traveled through concrete walls and open windows. Those early days shaped him more than any stage would. He found comfort in sound. He found identity in the beats he made with nothing but breath and courage. People around him saw a big kid with a bigger laugh, but those close to him knew he carried a sensitivity that rarely showed. He watched the world carefully. He listened even more. And long before he became Buffy of the Fat Boys, he was the one who could turn a small circle of friends into a room full of joy. When his career began, it was almost accidental. The streets already knew him. The energy, the humor, the sound no one else could make. Older artists and young kids admired him for the same reason. He had something raw, something unpolished and honest, a piece of hip-hop before it learned how to dress itself for cameras. The industry saw potential in him, but not the whole of him. It wanted the beatbox, the comedy, the spectacle. It did not want the young man behind it, the one who dreamed of belonging in a culture he helped define. And Buffy, still early in his life, believed the doors opening in front of him would stay open. He trusted the system because he did not yet know how quickly it changed its loyalties. As the years passed, the world evolved around him. Music shifted. Executives shifted. New faces replaced familiar ones. And Buffy found himself standing in the same culture he loved while feeling strangely outside of it. He tried to adapt. He tried to hold on to the sound that once brought him purpose. But the system had already moved its attention elsewhere. These were the years people rarely talk about. The years when he looked in the mirror and wondered what part of himself he was allowed to keep. The industry had taken his talent and amplified it, but when he needed room to grow or change, that room was nowhere to be found. He carried the weight of that realization quietly. Not out of pride, but out of habit. Buffy had always been the one to entertain, not the one to complain. There were days when he replayed old footage and sat still, as if waiting for something inside him to answer back. There were nights when he practiced beatbox patterns, even though no stage was waiting for him. It was not nostalgia. It was survival. A way to remind himself that what he created still had meaning, even if the world no longer said his name. The saddest truth is that he never lost his talent. He lost the space to use it. The system moved forward without acknowledging the people who built its early foundation. And Buffy felt that loss every day. Not as bitterness, but as a quiet ache that settled deep in the places only he could feel. Yet through all of it, he remained gentle to the world. He spoke softly. He laughed easily. And even when the industry turned its back, he stayed loyal to the music that once gave him everything. In that loyalty, he kept his dignity. In that loyalty, his story continued, even when no one was watching. There comes a moment in every pioneer's life when silence becomes heavier than words. For Buffy, that moment arrived long after the applause faded. It did not happen on a stage. It happened in a backstage hallway, under a weak light, with only a few people close enough to hear him speak. He had been invited to a small event meant to honor the early voices of hip-hop, a nostalgic night, a symbolic gesture. But when he arrived, he felt the distance immediately. Younger artists filled the room. Executives shook hands with cameras nearby. And the pioneers stood quietly in the corners, as if they were props from another time. Buffy watched the flow of the room, the conversations, the laughter, the casual way people passed by him without recognizing what he had done. It was not anger that rose in him. It was truth, a truth he had carried too long. When he finally spoke, the room did not fall silent. Only those nearest turned their heads. His voice was steady, but there was a tremor beneath it, the kind that appears only when someone speaks from a wound. He said the industry had learned to profit from the culture without protecting its creators. He said the early days mattered, that the sound he made with his breath had been copied, polished, branded, and sold, while his name slipped further from the conversation. He said pioneers deserved more than memories. They deserved recognition, protection, and a place in the story that did not vanish when the market shifted. It was not a speech. It was a release. A quiet attempt to reclaim something that belonged to him. Some people nodded. Some looked away. A few offered soft words that sounded more like apologies than answers. But the weight of what he said hung in the air, not because it was dramatic, but because it was true. In that small moment, he confronted a system far larger than himself, a system that had built a billion-dollar empire on the backs of young black artists who never received the credit, the royalties, or the longevity they deserved. Buffy knew he could not change the industry. He could only speak the truth he had lived. When he finished, there was a long pause. Not uncomfortable, just real. A moment where people wondered whether they should clap, comment, or let the truth sit where he placed it. He did not wait for their response. He simply nodded and stepped away, as if the words had done what they needed to do. That night became a turning point. Not a rise. Not a comeback. But the last time he tried to explain himself to a world that had already chosen its new heroes. He walked out of the building into cold air, breathing slow, his breath forming a cloud in the dark. It looked almost like the beginning of a beat, a small rhythm rising from the silence. For a moment, it seemed like he wanted to say more, but he did not. The truth had already been spoken. Whether the world heard it or not was no longer his burden. The truth about the industry did not reveal itself all at once. It unfolded slowly, like a door closing inch by inch, until the room behind it disappeared. For artists like Buffy, the shift was not only professional, it was personal. It touched identity, dignity, and the simple need to be seen. When hip-hop entered its commercial era, contracts grew sharper. Executives gained power. Images were reshaped for television. The culture that once belonged to the streets began answering to boardrooms. And in that transition, many early black artists lost ownership of the very things they created. Buffy was one of them. He had helped make beatboxing a language, a signature sound of the early movement. But the industry often treated pioneers as raw material, not partners. Styles were taken, sounds were replicated, and new performers were marketed as the next evolution, without any mention of the ones who came before. As the years passed, those choices had consequences. Royalties did not grow. Opportunities shrank. The excitement around his name faded from the conversations that shaped the future of the genre. People assumed he had stepped back. The truth was harder. He had been pushed aside by a machine that valued what he produced more than the man himself. He felt that loss most clearly in the small details. A show offer that never arrived. An interview request that went to someone else. A young performer copying his signature horn sound and being praised for innovation. It was not jealousy. It was invisibility. Friends noticed the change in him, not in his voice, but in his silence. He spoke less about the music industry. He stopped expecting the phone to ring. And when people asked if he missed the spotlight, he answered gently, as if trying not to trouble them with the weight he carried. But the heaviest part was financial. The industry had grown into a billion-dollar force, yet many of the men who helped build its early identity did not share in that growth. Buffy lived modestly, often choosing between essentials while trying to maintain his health. The system had no safety net for pioneers, no structure to honor the first generation with dignity. There were attempts to bring him back into the spotlight, but they were brief. Short features, small appearances, nothing steady enough to rebuild a life around. People who knew him later said the hardest thing for him was not the lack of work. It was knowing that his contribution had been reduced to a footnote, that the horn sound which once shook crowds was now a piece of history, few credited to his name. There were moments when the truth became impossible to ignore. A documentary released without mentioning him. A music award show celebrating the roots of hip-hop without playing a single clip of the Fat Boys. Each moment was a quiet erasure, a rewriting of history in real time. And the cost of that erasure was not measured in dollars. It was measured in spirit, in the slow fading of a man who had once given the world a new way to breathe rhythm into silence. Buffy carried that truth with a softness that made it even more painful. He did not fight the industry. He did not plead for attention. He simply lived with the weight of being forgotten, even as the echoes of his work continued in every beatboxer who followed. Across the United States, the story of hip-hop's rise is often told through familiar faces and familiar narratives. A few names are repeated. A few moments are preserved. But the deeper history, the one built by the first generation of young black performers, remained scattered across memories instead of museums. Buffy's absence from the mainstream record of hip-hop is not unique. It reflects a larger pattern in American entertainment. The early architects often receive the least recognition. Their stories are remembered only by those who were there, watching the culture form in real time. And as the industry grew, the world absorbed a version of hip-hop that rarely acknowledged the hands that shaped it. Outside the country, the situation was similar. International audiences embraced the sound, the rhythm, and the style, but they learned it without learning its origins. People in Europe, Asia, and South America copied beatbox patterns that Buffy created without knowing his name. Clubs played music influenced by the Fat Boys without ever showing a single photo of the group. His contribution traveled farther than he ever did, but the credit did not follow. In academic circles, a slow shift began. Researchers studying the cultural history of hip-hop started naming pioneers who had been overlooked. They pointed to the early 80s, to the raw performances, to the innovation born in neighborhoods that had no stage and no spotlight. Some of them spoke Buffy's name with the respect he deserved, calling him one of the earliest voices to push beatboxing into the center of hip-hop performance. But those voices were small compared to the noise of the commercial world. Among fans in America, especially older listeners, the memory of Buffy never faded. They remembered the sound he made by breath alone. They remembered the joy and the humor he carried into every performance. They remembered how groundbreaking he was, even if the industry did not. For them, the truth was simple. Hip-hop would not look the same without him. And in that loyalty, a quiet movement formed. People began speaking his name again, sharing his performances, correcting the record when younger listeners misunderstood where beatboxing began. It did not erase the years of silence, but it challenged them. It opened a door for the world to look back and finally see what had been missed. Buffy's legacy survived because ordinary people refused to forget. And sometimes, that is where the real preservation of history begins. There are stories that close neatly, with clear endings and perfect symmetry. Buffy's story is not one of them. His life moved through light and shadow, through applause and silence, through recognition and erasure. But even without a grand finale, his legacy stands with a quiet certainty. Some stories end without closure, but dignity does not need applause. What he left behind cannot be measured by charts or sales. It lives in the breath of every beatboxer who learned to shape sound out of nothing. It lives in the rhythm of early hip-hop, in the laughter he sparked, in the energy he carried into rooms too small for his talent. It lives in the memories of people who grew up with his music, long before the industry learned how to package the culture into a business. And for those who witnessed the early years, Buffy represents something deeper than a performer. He represents the truth that pioneers often give more than they receive. That the foundation of a culture is built by hands the world rarely thanks. That history is sometimes written too quickly, leaving out the names that mattered most. Yet his presence has not faded. People still speak his name. Fans still tell stories about the first time they heard that horn sound. Artists still feel the echoes of what he created, even if they do not realize who shaped the path beneath them. Legacy is not about being seen. It is about being felt. And Buffy is still felt. To anyone who has ever stood alone at the edge of a world they helped build, this story is for you. To anyone who watched the industry move on without looking back, this story carries your truth too. And to those who remember Buffy not as a forgotten figure, but as a cornerstone of early hip-hop, your memory is a form of justice. If his story reminds you of a moment, a sound, or a time in your life, share it. Your memory keeps the truth alive. If you believe pioneers deserve their flowers, help carry this legacy forward so his name never fades again. Buffy may no longer stand on the stage, but the rhythm he gave the world has not stopped. It moves quietly. It moves deeply. And if you listen closely, you can still hear him in the breath between the beats.